Good morning. My name is Eric McGhee, and I'm a policy director and senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, where we're featuring the findings from PPIC's latest report, Do Registration Reforms Add New Voters or Keep Californians Registered? Today's event is supported with funding from the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle. We'd like to thank them for their support. For today's program, I will present some of the key findings from the report and then open it up for some Q&A from our virtual audience. Originally, we were going to be joined by my co-author, Mindy Romero, who is the director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC's Sol Price School of Public Policy. Fortunately, Mindy is sick. And if any of you know Mindy, you know that if Mindy isn't showing up for something because she's sick, it means she's really sick. So best of luck for a speedy recovery, Mindy. Hope she feels better soon. If you have a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And now, let's get on with the presentation. Let me share my slides here. So the report we're presenting today looks at a couple of key reforms that have been introduced in California recently that affect how the voter registration process happens in the state. The main one that everybody thinks about is what's called California New Motor Voter. This is a process at the Department of Motor Vehicles when you go to get a new driver's license or renew an existing one, or do the same thing for a state ID, where you are automatically asked the questions about voter registration, and you have to answer those questions in order to complete your agency transaction. So it really presses DMV customers to engage with the voter registration process. The goal of this reform there's actually multiple goals. One of the primary ones is to increase the overall registration rate, so to get more people on the voter file. Another is to make the electorate more representative of the broader population. So California's electorate is younger, its population is younger and more diverse, in particular than the voting population. So the hope with this kind of reform is to make the registered population more representative of that broader population. And then just generally to maintain the voter file better, to make sure that it's up to date and that it's clean and it doesn't have inaccuracies. Now, if we want to increase registration, we think of that as being a process of adding new people to the file, but then it can actually occur in one of two ways. Let's imagine that we have a voter file here with, how many do we have? 16 voters. Before we had the new motor voter reform, in an election one, we have 9 of those, 16 are registered and the rest are unregistered. And then at some later election, we can imagine that there might be a couple of new people who come onto the file. That's the shaded slashed lines. But then you note that also a couple have dropped off the file, most likely because they moved, and in this case, we're going to assume they moved within the state, but didn't get re-registered at their new address, and so they're no longer on the file. So those are the kind of the two. You can see that this change that's happening in the file ends up with kind of a net zero outcome, the same number of registered voters. After the reform, certainly we can imagine that a reform like this is going to add more new registrants. So now here, we're still losing the 2 who are now unregistered where they weren't before, but we're also adding 2 more new registrants, so that the actual size of the file is a little bit larger. However, we could also imagine that instead of adding additional new registrants, we could just keep the people who had previously dropped off on the file, and their registration records would be updated. So that's another way that we can actually still end up with a larger file, a more active file than before the reform, even though we haven't technically added as many new people. And then, of course, we can also just add those new people too. These are not mutually exclusive. Reform can both increase the number of address updates and also add more new registrants. So why does this? Why are we bringing this up? Well, there actually has been a change to voter registration that's separate from CNMV, from this new motor voter law. When the state of California got its central statewide voter file called VOCAL, it made moves across county lines easier for updating the voter file. So before VOCAL, you had to, when you moved to a new county, you had to actually re-register in that new county in order to update your record. Certainly you'd get some reminders to do that process, but you still had to do it yourself. It was the onus was on you. Now, after VOCAL, that process more or less happens automatically if you go to the DMV and tell them that you've moved, or if you submit a change of address through the post office. So it's moved from something that's a little bit onerous to something that's very easy. So either way, we certainly have seen that the voter file is larger under these two big changes to the registration process. So we're now at just about record registration rates in the state. So a really big surge that we've seen. And so what we want to kind of understand is, first of all, like what's driving that change? Like, is it really one of these reforms or the other? And is it more of these kinds of new registrations, or the address updates? And why does this distinction matter? Well, a few reasons. First, there's a distinction here between whether we're actually expanding the size of the electorate, or whether we're kind of maintaining the electorate that we have. It's not a problem to maintain the existing voter file and to make sure that people stay on the file when they move. That's a laudable public policy goal, but it is different from actually expanding the scope of the file and making sure that more people are included. It's also worth noting that new registrants tend to come from a lot of the underrepresented groups that we would like to see, that the state would like to see be on the file. So they're younger, they're more likely to be Black, Latino, and Asian American. And so if that's your goal to make the file more representative, on the other side of the ledger with the address updates are younger, but they tend to be younger and not as likely to be people of color. So they're more likely to be white. And then these new registrants are actually less likely to be engaged. I'll show you some data to that effect in a little bit. But so there's a kind of a different outreach strategy that's likely to be involved. So we want to answer a few questions here in this report and then in this presentation today. First is to just compare address updates versus new registrations as a consequence of these reforms. The second is to compare CNMV as a cause of these changes versus the VOCAL cross-county updates change, and then look at some of the equity effects, whether we're seeing larger changes for underrepresented groups or not. Really quickly, how do we, what kind of data are we looking at? How do we identify these effects? Well, we have a couple different data sources. One is from Political Data Incorporated. We have registration files from 2012, 2016, and 2020 that we've merged together. So we know how the file has changed over those periods of time. So we can see, okay, how much change was there between 12 and 16, and compare that to change between 16 and 20 when the new reforms were in place. The other is we have national data from Catalyst, the data vendor Catalyst, county registration aggregates that also have this, who's new, who's moved, et cetera, kind of information. So we can look at the distinction between new registrations and address updates at the national level and see how automatic voter registration programs like the one in California have worked more generally. We also have to think about the baseline here in the sense of, if we have a number of people who are, say, address updates, that's as a share of what? Like, is that a big number or a small number? How many are we talking about? And so we have a couple of different approaches to that. One, we look at all voting eligible residents. So that's all citizens 18 and over. The second, though, is to look at what we call potential beneficiaries, because not all voting eligible residents could actually update their addresses because they wouldn't have moved, right? Or they couldn't be new registrants because they're already registered. So we make sure to try to design a denominator here, a divisor that that accounts for that. It includes only those who could potentially be affected by the change in each case, and just to try and make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. All right, so what kind of change did we see under these reforms? Well, first, both address updates and new registrations are up in California from 2016 to 2020 compared to 2012 to 2016. So you can see that that's true both as a share of the voting eligible and also as a share of the potential beneficiaries. As a share of the voting eligible, the new registrations look a lot larger. But then when we put it in the context of how many people have moved versus how many people are available to be registered for the first time, the difference in like percentage terms is not as large. So it's a little bit more of a 50-50 kind of thing. So we're seeing that this is kind of a mix. It's the changes we're seeing in the file are a mix of these two potential sources of change. We also are able to see with our data how many of the address updates occurred across county lines versus within county lines. And remember that any within county move was not affected by this change to this vocal change to the process. So it wouldn't have been impacted by that. And you can see that, so we saw an 8% increase in within county updates and a 9.8% increase in cross-county updates. So it's a little bit larger for the cross-county, which tells you that maybe this vocal change has had some effect. But we're also seeing a big increase for within county, which tells us that the California new motor voter is actually the more likely source of this increase in address updates, more than the vocal change. There's also a big question here, which is, okay, we compare 2012 to 2016 and then look at that relative to 2016 to 2020. There are a lot of other things that were going on between 2016 and 2020. In particular, like the 2020 election was a very high turnout election and people were very engaged. You could totally imagine that the increases that we're seeing are driven by not the reforms that we're talking about, but by this greater engagement with the election process. So this is where we bring the catalyst data to bear. We have national data, and we're able to see states that adopted some kind of automatic voter registration reform, like the California new motor voter, versus states that didn't. And the states that didn't were also impacted by the excitement of the 2020 election. And so we're able to kind of compare like the changes in one versus the change in the other to see if there's more of a change in states that have automatic voter registration. And the answer is yes, there is, both in terms of address updates and new registrations and in terms of the voting eligible population and in terms of potential beneficiaries. And it's true for both the address updates and the new registrations. On the whole, the size of the change is not quite as large as in California, and that could be either because California's reforms have packed more of a punch, or just because California is a different sort of state, right, and was more engaged for some other reason. But we're basically seeing a similar kind of story where it's a mix of the two effects. And this is something closer to identifying causation, and saying, yes, AVR is actually the cause of these changes and not just coincidentally happening at the same time that there was a lot of excitement in the election. And our last question is, have we seen larger changes for underrepresented groups? The answer here is a little bit more mixed. So we actually, among address updates, and this is now all just within California specifically, but for address updates, we actually see the biggest increases in percentage terms among middle-aged Californians and not among the very young. In terms of race and ethnicity, a little bit larger increase for Asian Americans, but it's really kind of across the board. And these are all the address updates, right? For new registrations, we see both middle-aged and the very young seeing a little bit more of a change. And then the Asian American increase is even more notable for new registrations, but also among non-Hispanic white registrants, we see a bigger increases. These are, again, new registrations. So the bottom line here is, okay, so first of all, the reform changes have been roughly split between new registrations and address updates. Maybe in California, a little bit more of the new registrations than the address updates, but some of both in each case. We can say that CNMV, the California New Motor Voter, accounts for most of the changes among address updates. And that when we look at things in national context, that automatic voter registration itself, more generally, is driving these changes in both new registrations and address updates. However, the equity effects, or in terms of making the voter file more representative, are more mixed. So we see larger effects for Asian Americans, but maybe less so for other groups. Sometimes it's the middle-aged who are seeing the biggest impact. And again, the goal here is to see a disproportionate effect for some of these underrepresented groups, since they are less represented on the voter file. And so we would say that the expectations about the pace of change from this reform, again, it has produced a notable increase in the size of the registration file in California, but we should sort of temper our expectations about the future pace of change, because we're doing a lot of making sure that the file is maintained as it is and not expanding its scope, and so the representativeness of the file may not accelerate in quite the rate that we would otherwise expect. And this is where we bring in also the need to think about the engagement of the new registrants who are being added to the file through this new motor voter process. So they have, we can see here, this is turnout in 2020. You can see that the people who were registered through CNMV and are new to the file had lower turnout in 2020 than either kinds of movers who were registered, or people who were newly registered on the file with some other method. So a particularly low turnout, which means this is a community who is going to need more outreach and more engagement. So our policy recommendations are to look for ways to, first of all, promote new registrations. One idea that has been discussed is to expand CNMV to more agencies where you're going to find perhaps more unregistered populations, like Covered California, Medi-Cal, CalWORKS, Cal EITC, those kinds of things. We also should be thinking seriously about targeted outreach to new CNMV registrants. We know who they are. If we can do that targeted outreach, it would be, I think, helpful to recognize that these are voters who may not be as likely to turn out to vote. And in that sense, I think it might make sense to leverage. We have a pre-registration process in California where you can register to vote when you're 16 or 17 and have your record sit dormant on the voter file until you turn 18, in which case it turns on. Since people are going to the DMV in disproportionate numbers when they're 16 and 17, there's a real synergy here between pre-registration and CNMV. And then there's also an opportunity here with these 16 and 17-year-olds who are being put on the file to mesh civics education with CNMV and try and make sure that they know that they're registered and know that they have an opportunity when they turn 18 to turn out to vote. So again, that's all the presentation that I have today. Again, submit your questions, please, to PPIC eventquestions@gmail.com. And let me just open it up to some of the questions that may have come in. All right, so one question we have here is, how does California add or update voter registration automatically, and how does that compare to other states? So that's a good question. California has what they call a front-end automatic voter registration process, which means that you are asked the questions when you go to the DMV. You are you have to sort of engage with them as part of that process. And then you're basically, if you are eligible to be registered, you're basically asked the questions no matter what. And because there's a touch screen and when you go to the DMV, and that touch screen, that computer process just automatically takes you to the voter registration questions and asks you if you want to engage with them or not. And so you have to at least say, no, I don't want to engage with those voter registration questions. And then you'll move on. But for a lot of people, that's an opportunity then to engage with it. In a lot of other states, they will, a lot of states do have a very similar kind of system. In fact, most other states that have some form of automatic voter registration do have this kind of front end process. There are some states, Massachusetts is one, Alaska is another, Oregon is the pioneer in this, have a what's called a back-end system where you don't actually get asked the voter registration questions at all as a part of your DMV transaction. You get a mailer after the fact that says, hey, we see that you went to the DMV and that you are eligible to be registered to vote, but you are not registered to vote. So we're going to register you to vote unless you send us this card back and tell us that you don't want to be. So, and that is just another process, another way of approaching it. It tends to cast a wider net in terms of drawing in registrants. And there is actually legislation in the state legislature to switch California to be more of that kind of the system. See, don't we know that young people move a lot and that people of color are less likely to be registered? So doesn't that mean that updating addresses and registering new people will make registered voters more representative? Yeah, so this is actually a good question. I mean, it seems a little counterintuitive to imagine that. I mean, we definitely have increased the number of new registrants. We definitely have increased the number of address updates. We know that address updates are younger. We know, and we talk about this in the report, that they're younger. We know that new registrants are younger and more likely to be people of color. So it would make sense then that we would see, you know, a bigger, a more representative file as a result of these reforms. And I think there is something to that, there to an extent. But we also, the thing to know about California is that California is becoming, the California eligible population that's eligible to vote is becoming more diverse. And so there are more Latinos in particular, but also Asian Americans, African Americans on in the broader population. So if we did nothing at all, we would expect to see some change in the voter file to become more diverse. But what we want, given if we're trying to make the voter file more representative, what we want instead is to have actually a disproportionate effect on communities that are less represented on the file in order to sort of catch up for the past disparity. Yes, the reforms I think are probably helping at the margins to make the voter file more representative no matter what, but we also would ideally want to see a much bigger effect for people of color, for young people than we're seeing currently. It's more just that they are also among those who are seeing an uptick in their address updates and their new registrations. And we'd like to see a bigger punch there than we're currently seeing. And in some cases, they actually are lagging behind. Their increases are lagging behind the increases in other groups. And then let's see, do we know anything about why folks are choosing not to engage and register through the DMV process? That is also an excellent question. We don't, so the DMV doesn't release information about the people who declined. We just kind of have some rough sense of how many people there are who turned it down, but we don't know if really whether they were eligible or not, why they decided not to get registered. We don't even really know how far they made it in the process before they bailed. And that just there's the data that come from the DMV is very closely protected and has a lot of privacy protections. So it's hard to know for sure. One way to get around that might be to try and engage people who have gone to the DMV and find out like what their customer process was and how well they engage with it. We have thought about doing some work like that, like for instance with exit polls of people coming out of the DMV. That would be one way to do it. We just haven't done it yet. It's kind of an expensive and involved process to do something like that. But the bottom line is there's no easy way to get at that kind of information because it doesn't just kind of come as a matter of course from official government statistics. All right, so let's see. If new AVR registrants have less experience with the political system, what's the best way to encourage them to vote? That's a tough one. I mean, I think one of the key questions that we wonder about, and Mindy is actually working on some research to look into this a little bit, is it's possible that some people who are registering through automatic voter registration don't even remember that they are registered to vote. It's a little less likely with a system like California, where you have to engage with the registration questions when you are at the DMV. But nonetheless, it's possible. I mean, people don't go to the DMV to be registered to vote. It's something that happens on the side and as a byproduct of going to the DMV. So they may not actually remember that they registered to vote. So that would be the easiest thing, right? If we could just remind them more diligently and more consistently that they are registered to vote, that would be an easy fix. Probably it's going to take more than that. It's going to take repeated touching base. It also is the case that if you are, we're adding a lot of new people to the voter file. And I think in many cases, campaigns are the ones who do a lot of the mobilization, but they don't necessarily know what to do with these new registrants who are sort of suddenly appearing on the file and don't have a voter history and didn't come from someplace in particular other than the DMV. So whether to expend the resources to mobilize them or not is an open question. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to do is start being more serious about just reaching out to people, regardless of whether we think that there's a likelihood that they're going to turn out to vote or not, and just start that conversation and do it in a really a way that speaks to their cultural experience and does it with trusted messengers who are from those communities. That's probably the best way to be constantly working on turning them into voters. But it's going to be a tough road, right? It's not going to be easy. What's nice about the California New Motor Voter process is that it makes sure that one part of the process, which is whether or not you're registered to vote, is taken care of. So they're all on the file, right? You can you have information about them. It makes contacting them easier, and so that part is now taken care of. And now you can worry about sort of the next step in the process. So I think we are just about at time. And maybe there's probably time for just one more question here, which is, isn't it possible that the high turnout around Trump and the 2020 election is producing all these changes in registration? And that kind of gets at what I was trying to get at in the presentation, which is yes, you would imagine that you would see this kind of change just from the excitement of the election in 2020. But we leveraged the fact that that kind of excitement around the 2020 election was occurring pretty much everywhere in the country. But only some states in the country had adopted something like automatic voter registration. So we were able to leverage that fact to get a sense of what the impact of AVR specifically is on the changes in the voter file. So I think with that, I will kind of wrap it up. We've reached the end of our program, and I'd like to again thank the PPIC corporate and donor circles for their support of today's program, and thank each and every one of you who've joined us here online today. We would appreciate you taking a moment to give us your feedback on this event. There's a QR code here that you can scan and then complete a short survey. If you don't do it, we can't get better at these things. So I really hope that you will take the time to do it. And we'll just leave this slide up for a moment to give people a chance to scan it if they want to. But thank you, and have a good afternoon.